I'll be presenting today on open source automated insulin delivery for clinicians. The topics I'll aim to cover in this session is describing commonly used open source automated insulin delivery systems, a brief word on the efficacy of these systems from the published literature, how to view the data from open source AID systems, and then the clinical approach to the patient on each open source AID system. So what are the settings that can be adjusted? What are the algorithm principles and some cases? What I'm not going to cover in this session is broader principles of automated insulin delivery use, management of commercially available systems such as Medtronic 780G and Tandem Control IQ, along with other general principles around AID use, sick day plans, and so on. So that's all considered assumed knowledge before heading into this particular presentation. And this presentation also is not designed to cover the ethics, medico-legal, and regulation of these systems. For that, I recommend that you do see the Diabetes Canada position statement as a starting point. So coming to open source automated insulin delivery, the idea here is that the patient is going to be using an approved CGM and an approved pump hardware, but the connection and control by software joining the pump and the CGM together is going to be an open source software that's housed on the patient's smartphone via an app. Because these are open source, they can be installed by patients at no financial cost. The code is freely available online, but there's also no Health Canada regulatory approval because there's no commercial entity which sits behind these apps. They're very much an open source community project where the expertise lies in this extraordinary community of developers and peer supporters rather than with a company. Much like the commercial AID systems that you're familiar with, these are going to provide some automated temporary basals and/or some auto-correction boluses aiming to improve glycemia, along with some predictive low glucose suspend. So you can see in the example picture here a setup of one of our patients where they have an insulin pump, being an Omnipod Dash in this case, a CGM being a Dexcom G6, and then they have their smartphone. In this case, it's an Android phone with an aAPS, Android Artificial Pancreas System, is the open source AID system that this patient is running, and that's providing the direct instructions to the insulin pump about insulin delivery and receiving the Dexcom readings from the continuous glucose monitor. So in terms of resources, there's myriad online resources that are from a community and a peer-to-peer level. The Loop docs and the aAPS docs are the online Bibles of those systems respectively. And there's a big community at Loop and Learn who provide a great deal of resources and support. In terms of Diabetes Canada resources, there's this excellent pair of companion articles published in the Canadian Journal of Diabetes last year, the position statement by Halperin and colleagues, and this healthcare practitioner's user's guide by Chambers and colleagues. So both of those are definitely worth a read. Coming to the open source AID systems, there's really three that we see in common usage, those being Loop, aAPS, and aAPS. So each is a different app which could be used. So Loop is run on an iPhone, and this is a screenshot of how the home screen appears. So the user is having this Loop app on their iPhone, and that's serving as the controller of everything that their pump is doing, basal rates, boluses, etc. So the user is interacting with this interface on their iPhone to deliver their insulin boluses, etc. iAPS is another system which is also run on an iPhone. Both iAPS and aAPS are drawn out of the original openAPS algorithm, but have since, undergone their own various iterations and development. So this is an image of the iAPS home screen. And then aAPS, Android APS, is run on an Android phone. And you can see the home screen here of how aAPS appears on the patient's phone. So in broad strokes, what the patient needs for setup is shown with loop being the example on this screen here. It looks complicated, but really it's just highlighting that the patient is going to have on the left their Dexcom typically, with those readings going through into the native Dexcom app on their iPhone. They then are going to have the Loop app, referred to as the DIY Loop app here. And pump hardware-wise, they would most commonly have an Omnipod Dash. So those are the key components of the automated insulin delivery system. That data can then be fed through into a couple of different platforms for viewing the open source data. So if you're used to commercial systems, think of Gluco or Diasend or Medtronic CareLink, how you're able to view the insulin and glucose data together. This is performed in an open source setting, either by Nightscout or by the platform Tidepool. So these are all the components that the user of Loop would have set up. In terms of evidence for the efficacy of these systems, this here is observational data from BCDiabetes, showing the first 248 patients who were installed at BCDiabetes. You can see in each column there's 108 Loop users, 114 iAPS, and 26 aAPS among that whole group. And for each, we have before and after for CGM parameters. So as a total group, the mean time in range prior was 64%. And after just about 3 weeks of use, the mean time in range came up to 80%. And you could see that that final time in range outcome was quite similar across systems. Time below range was 2.5% in the follow-up study, and the overall percentage of patients reaching a standard benchmark international time in range of above 70% was brought up to the majority of patients, up to 84% of individuals then meeting that benchmark once they had the open source system running. So this is observational data. You can clearly see that as a starting group, the time in range being in the mid-60s was already quite a high level of near target glycemia being achieved among this group. That said, on an anecdotal basis, we've subsequently seen a greater broadening of candidates who are able to get a good benefit for time in range when starting at a lower baseline than this particular published group. In terms of randomized controlled trial data, there have been 2 RCTs examining aAPS. That's the only open source system with published RCTs. And this is the largest one published in the New England Journal in 2022 out of New Zealand. And you can see that as a baseline, we had the children prior to being on their automation were at 57% and brought up to 67% once they were using aAPS. And adults also brought up similarly by about 10% from baseline 64 up to 74 once they were on the system. So this is the CREATE trial of aAPS versus sensor-augmented pump therapy. And in the controls, just using sensor-augmented pump therapy, they had no change in their time in range, no improvement in their time in range throughout. Coming to the clinical approach to the patient using an open source system. So we'll start with viewing the data. Nightscout or Tidepool can both be used to view open source data. I'm displaying Nightscout here, and you'll see that for an individual patient's Nightscout, this is going to be a URL that is built, so it doesn't, it's not within a clinic platform in the way that Dexcom Clarity or similar is with patients accepting an invitation. It's rather the patient providing their Nightscout URL, which can have token codes to protect privacy. And this is how a Nightscout appears. So you've got a range of different tabs to select from to provide your day-to-day views, distributions, percentile charts, etc. This is demonstrating a day-by-day view, so I'll just orient to the tracing here for all of our future cases. So the CGM data is displayed in the green, and in this case, we just have it selected on a standard 3.9 to 10 millimole per liter as the display range. And so we have our CGM trace there. Our insulin data is displayed beneath in the blue. So you have your basal insulin shown in the blue shading, And so anywhere that there's a complete absence of the blue shading, like here and here, this means the basal has been completely suspended. If we see that the basal is dropping down lower than this light blue hashed line, which shows what the full scheduled basal would be. If we have basal dropping down lower than that, then this is the system doing an automatic reduction in basal rate in response to glycemic trends. We then have bolus insulin shown in the darker blue. So this could be either a user-entered bolus, such as this one here for a meal of 5.9 units, or this could be system-driven auto-corrections, which is commonly these, small, for example, 0.05 units, 0.1 units, frequently, so every 5-minute loop cycle, these can be delivered if determined necessary. You then have your meal specifically shown in red, so with the number of grams displayed there for the carb entry that the patient has made. Other tabs available within Nightscout, for example, is the distribution and this percentile chart, which provides a similar to an AGP style view of what the CGM tracing has been. Okay, coming to system 1, which is loop. So we'll go through what settings can be adjusted within loop, what are the algorithm principles, and some cases. So to frame this in context of most clinicians' understanding of AID, you'll know that with the existing available commercial systems, there's a number of settings that can be adjusted that actually impact upon the performance of the system when it's in auto mode. And so, for example, with Tandem Control IQ, there's limited adjustment of target in the sense of being able to change to exercise, activity, etc. You then are able to adjust carb ratios, insulin sensitivities, and basal rates. So within Loop, you also can adjust these same parameters. You can adjust carb ratio, insulin sensitivity, and basal rates. All of these program settings are part of what the system is delivering when it's in automation. So it's taking these programmed amounts as the baseline expectation for what the patient is needing, and then each 5-minute loop cycle, it's modulating either way as required. And each of these can be time blocked throughout the 24-hour period. In terms of the target, which in Loop gets the name correction range, there's actually a much wider range within which you can select the glucose target. So anywhere between 4.8 and 10 millimoles per liter can be the target. So wider range of choices than what we get with the commercially available systems in Canada. There's a few additional settings, none of which are too mind-bending. We have a glucose safety limit, so the user is able to choose effectively their suspend threshold. So if Loop is predicting that they're going to reach this particular threshold, that is when they'll get a complete basal suspend. So for context, it would be a common setup for adults to have their target, their correction range at, say, 5.5 millimoles per liter, and to have their glucose safety limit at 3.9 millimoles per liter, for example. And that glucose safety limit is functioning within a predictive low glucose suspend. So it's not reaching that glucose that will trigger a suspend. It's if that glucose is predicted by Loop that you'll get a complete basal suspend. You then set just a hard maximum on the allowed basal rate and bolus size. Most users coming from an Omnipod DASH system will already have such maximums programmed into their DASH system. And then finally, you select a dosing strategy. So this can be selected as either temp basal only or auto bolus, which we'll discuss on the next slide. Note within these settings to adjust that there is no adjustment of duration of insulin action within this system. It is a fixed parameter at 6 hours in Loop. So coming to the Loop algorithm, Loop predicts the blood glucose in the future based on the insulin on board, the carbs on board, the blood glucose momentum, meaning current glucose and the recent rate of change, and on a retrospective correction, which is the concept of what is the difference between the predicted and actual blood glucose in the past 30 minutes. So this is a kind of minor modulation on the Loop algorithm. Once Loop algorithm has determined what the blood glucose projection is for the eventual blood glucose in the future. It then does relatively simple diabetes math to just determine the predicted blood glucose minus the target blood glucose, and this is divided by the ISF. This is the ISF that we have programmed, not something that, that Loop changes on its own. So this is how the system is determining the insulin required. Once we know how much insulin is required, Loop will go ahead and provide that additional insulin, depending on which dose strategy has been selected. So if it's a temp basal only, then it's going to provide the additional insulin by giving a higher basal rate. And this can be modulated and revisited every 5-minute loop cycle. If we've selected auto bolus mode as our dosing strategy, then the extra insulin that's required will be delivered by Loop in the form of auto correction boluses. So up to 40% of the total recommended bolus based on this diabetes math can be given as a single auto bolus. So 40% just to, act somewhat conservatively on each loop cycle, but then more correction can be given every 5-minute loop cycle if required. And then, of course, if blood glucose is predicted to fall below that glucose safety limit that we've programmed, then a complete basal suspend will occur. Just a note on the carbs on board consideration is that within Loop, there is an option for the patient to select their expected absorption time for food. So for most meals, people will enter a standard 3-hour absorption time, which is represented by this taco symbol. But there is the option to guide Loop that the user is expecting their carbs on board to have quite a long tail in terms of time that those carbs will be on board. And they could do that by selecting the pizza icon for 5 hours. So that selection of food type is really working with the carb on board absorption model so that Loop hopefully has an accurate idea how long those carbs are to be considered on board, and therefore can most accurately include that as part of the overall blood glucose prediction using all 4 factors. A final word on Loop configuration before we get into cases. So in Loop, we have the ability to set up custom presets. So if you're used to other AID systems, you may think of things like an exercise mode, or things like in manual pumping, having a temporary basal rate that you set, which is different from your normal. Loop custom presets is in that vein, in that we can have a temporary change to the amount of insulin delivery that we require, but just with greater flexibility and individualization. So for example, with an exercise preset in Loop, an individual may set up many exercise presets for all different types of activities if they need it. So one example of how they might set it up could be an overall insulin needs set at 50%. If that's at 50%, this means our whole system is at a 50% level of insulin delivery. Basal, carb ratio, and insulin sensitivity factor are all made half strength while this is running at a 50%. So this is obviously going to make the system much gentler. Our ISF will be half the strength, so our corrections will be gentler. And indeed, the system's determination of how much insulin is required to get to target will be much less, because we're fundamentally working with a weaker ISF while this system is configured to 50%. Within your custom preset, you can also set up your preferred target range. So for exercise, many people will set this a bit higher so that they're not receiving correction boluses attempting to get them down to their usual target of 5.5 while they're exercising. And the duration can also be selected, and the user may switch it off earlier if they choose, but the duration that's programmed, it will run for that long if the user doesn't interact with the system again. Similarly, custom presets can be used for situations of greater overall insulin requirements. So this could be used, for example, in a premenstrual setting, if a user typically finds they need 120% of their overall insulin delivery. They can actually set that up as an enable indefinitely. So they could leave that on for several days, for example, and just have the whole system running at 120%, and then switch that off when they need to. So custom presets are quite powerful within Loop. Let's do some cases. So we're going to be looking at several cases. They're all patients with type 1 diabetes who are commencing loop, and they're all coming from an Omnipod DASH system previously. So case 1, this is a 50-year-old man, long-standing type 1 with complications, BMI is 27, his baseline A1C is 8%, and total daily dose 45 units. This is a snapshot of his clarity from prior to loop, and time in range is 47%. And you can see, from his overnight profile high just sitting consistently above target that, that's the type of overnight profile which is so amenable to coming down with any form of automation. So we get started on loop, and in terms of his setup, we go with, he has no particular problems around fear of hypoglycemia or frequent hypoglycemia. So he's happy to start with a target of 5.5 and a glucose safety limit of 3.9. We keep his standard carb ratio. We do weaken his insulin sensitivity a little on starting the system, just as a safety consideration. Needs to be individualized for the patient, but his prior ISF of 1 unit for 2 millimoles per liter was quite strong relative to his total daily dose and was at a level that I anticipated probably would have been too aggressive on loop with its 5-minute corrections, just applying that ISF much more frequently throughout the day than what he's doing previously. Otherwise, basal rate's the same as usual, so just that ISF weekend to start out. So week 1 on loop, as expected, that overnight profile just, is much improved with the automation, and his time in range comes up to 81%, so really good improvement in the first week without excess hypoglycemia. In fact, he was so pleased with the system and found it so responsive, and he was so happy to see that he could get these autocorrection boluses just to bring him to target without frank hypoglycemia, that he actually thought he might just try not bolusing for meals, just as his own experiment. So you can see here, on this Saturday, for example, he's clearly eaten here without a bolus and just watched to see how the system would perform. And other occasions, he's just sort of bolusing once per day because he's just delighted really to have a bit of a holiday of bolusing. So notably, loop is not designed to be fully closed loop, so users are still advised to bolus for their carb-containing meals. As with many automated systems, some users may find that they can reach target glycemia without bolusing. That's typically going to require some optimization of the ISF and basal, and perhaps a relatively low-carb diet in order to get by without bolusing. But certainly we would recommend people to still bolus for meals. And of course, there's probably going to be some risk of late post-meal lows following auto boluses. So if we miss a meal bolus here, go high, all of these auto corrections from loop are coming in afterwards to try to chase down that high, which goes fine here, but it's effectively just late meal bolusing. And so, there would be some risk of a late low, depending on how the system's configured and how much this degree of basal suspending here is able to avert a low sort of 3-4 hours post-meal. So that's case 1. He carried on in his second week, just bolusing, not all the time, but sometimes. Time in range still good. But what we did notice in his second week is that he was having this consistent pattern of lows at around 8 to 9 a.m. And, reviewing this, you would think, there's a few considerations for what you could change here in order to avert these lows. At the time of the lows, there's been predominantly just basal running in the preceding hours, sometimes some corrections. It would certainly be justified to either lower the basal or weaken the ISF. Both could probably be effective through this time, given that if the ISF was weaker through here, you'd get more basal suspense. But given how this basal appeared to be tracking, we opted to lower the basal from 4 a.m. onwards so that he'd receive less basal through this segment. And that was pretty successful in averting those 8 a.m. lows. So you can see now, just for the sake of practicing how the Nightscout appears, you can see that we have a scheduled basal reduction here at 4 a.m. And that's with this light blue shading dropping down there. And yeah, slightly lesser insulin delivery through that time, and not having those frank lows. So key points from loop case 1, I would say that auto boluses can provide excellent time in range improvement by correcting to target every 5-minute loop cycle. Loop is not designed to be fully closed loop, so we still recommend people bolus for their carb-containing meals. And basal rate adjustments in loop can be made for specific time blocks to target individual glucose patterns. Coming to case 2. This is a young woman, 27 years of age, baseline A1C 8.4%, and total daily dose 30 units. You can see she has a time in range of 32% prior to starting on loop. Once again, has those highs overnight, so which tend to do so well with automation. Really variable and busy lifestyle, young mother, busy with a toddler and so on. So once again, we started on fairly, didn't change too much about her settings starting out on loop. These are basically the same settings that she had on her Omnipod Dash system. Once again, target 5.5, suspend threshold of 3.9. And week 1, I was very happy. Time in range up at 74%, time low acceptable 0.7%. Predominantly, those overnights really being brought down to improve that time in range. However, from the patient's point of view, this was, a really dramatic change. And even though she had felt that she would like to get her glucose levels much lower, once she was actually there, she felt a bit uncomfortable. Was uncomfortable with trending down overnight. And even though it was only 0.7% time below range overall, some of these events were troublesome for her. So certainly this picture, when we see this type of zigzag on loop, that's classically going to be suggesting that our insulin sensitivity factor is too strong, because we can see that it's loop's corrections that are sort of driving down to a low here. We get a basal suspend, so therefore it's only quite a mild low, fine. But in emerging from that low, we see more corrections from loop. It's not adapting in any way really to the recent low. It's just purely seeing this uptrend in the Dexcom tracing. Now it's probably projecting a glucose of 15 or something, because we're on this upward trend. So it's coming in with these corrections to try to avert that, and we're back down into a second low. So that always suggests to me that our insulin sensitivity factor is too strong. We should be able to have these corrections, just, avoid a high, but not be pulling down back into a second low. So we want to help avoid that for her and help make the system overall something that she can tolerate and get used to. So we changed our overnight glucose target to 6 millimoles per liter instead of the 5.5, just so she'd feel a bit more comfortable overnight, and weakened the insulin sensitivity factor by 10%, so from 3.6 to 4. So in this way, she was sort of able to get settled on loop in a way that was acceptable to her. This resulted in a time in range not quite as good, 65%, but somewhat fewer lows, and the pattern looked more typically like this. So you can see that where these corrections are performing, these every 5-minute loop cycle corrections, they're not actually pulling down into a low. So that's the weaker ISF resulted in that. So this is just a zoomed in sort of view on how the ISF, what we tend to see when the ISF is too strong. So we do need to avoid a too strong ISF that sort of causes this zigzag pattern. Okay, loop case 3. So this is a woman who is postpartum, about 6 months, and breastfeeding. Her bigger problem on her previous system, the Omnipod Dash, was lows. So she was having nearly 5% time below range. Her A1C was actually down at 5.4%. She was a mother of two, had erratic sleep patterns, was sort of frequently eating at night and then correcting late and crashing into lows. So in addition to that, she noticed some lows during breastfeeding. So when setting up on Loop, we kept similar configuration to what she'd had previously, though did weaken the insulin sensitivity factor because she was crashing into lows with her corrections. In addition to this whole kind of standard profile, we also set up one of these custom presets for her. So she called it her nursing custom preset. This is for breastfeeding. And we set it up quite similar to an exercise profile. So overall insulin needs set at 50% and a target set at 8 millimoles per liter. So our first week on system, time in range, still fine. That's similar to what it was before in the mid-70s. Lows brought down to 3.2%, so not brought down as much as I would like. And if we check out an individual day, we're seeing we still have this pattern of sort of snacking overnight, bolus is probably a bit late, and there's all of these auto corrections from the system around this time trying to correct, and they're still a bit too strong because we're brought right down to 4 here, and this is with over 2 hours, nearly, in fact, over 3 hours of complete basal suspend has been required here to avert this low. So these corrections look pretty strong still. And then in addition, she's applied her nursing preset for her breastfeeding, which is fine. But because she's headed into that session already low and already with quite a bit of insulin on board from these preceding boluses at around 6 p.m., unfortunately, there's nothing this nursing preset can do because the insulin on board is already so high from all of this prior that the nursing preset has put the insulin delivery all the way down to nothing, but you can't go any less than nothing. So we're still having a low because of our prior insulin on board. So to address that plan, we suggested let's try to activate that custom preset early so that in the preceding hour before the breastfeeding, Loop is going to be able to de-escalate our insulin on board because that custom preset at the 50% is going to help us with that. We're going to have a half-strength ISF, so we'll get much fewer corrections leading up and head into our breastfeeding session with less insulin on board. In addition, these corrections overnight look strong, so we'll move our ISF from 4 to 4.5. And with those tweaks, able to get the lows down to less than 2%, so starting to head in the right direction there. And we can see that with these overnight corrections, she still needs them at midnight, but they are, just getting down to target rather than causing a low. And with the nursing preset, with this earlier activation here, we're able to have that running in a way where there's less insulin on board heading into that session. And in fact, even with running at a 50% rate, we can see that this time the system's actually continuing the basal at a 50% rate for the majority of the time, and we're not having a low. So we've headed into that custom preset more optimized in terms of hypo avoidance for that session. So that's our weaker ISF and our nursing custom preset. So key points for case 3. For those with frequent hypoglycemia, really consider weakening settings prior to the loop start. So we did that in this case with an ISF weakening, but we really needed to go even further. And then once somebody's on loop, your strategy is to reduce hypoglycemia. Weakening the ISF is really powerful to reduce hypoglycemia on loop, and using custom presets for periods of reduced insulin requirements. So that could be exercise or what have you, and really activating those early makes a difference. Of course, you can change any parameter to reduce hypoglycemia. So it could be basal, could be carb ratio, could be target, but oftentimes we find that when people are starting out on loop, these can be the ones that are the most relevant for them. And oftentimes people ISF, it can be previously programmed a bit strong relative to what's needed on loop. All right, case 4, this is our final loop case. So this is a patient who commenced loop in pregnancy. So it's probably beyond the scope of this presentation to fully lay out the pros and cons of changing insulin delivery modality once already pregnant. But I'm really going to use this case more to demonstrate what is the approach to somebody whose insulin requirements are changing week to week. So this could just as easily be somebody on a variable corticosteroid regimen or some other situation where they're needing to change their amount of insulin delivery. And the takeaway is Loop doesn't do it for you. We need to go in and actually reconfigure the settings in line with what the patient's needing. So this case, we have a pre-loop Dexcom Clarity snapshot here. We're using our pregnancy targets of 3.5 to 7.8 millimole per liter here throughout. So for that tight pregnancy range, we were at 62% on the Omnipod DASH system. At this point, she was already 19 weeks gestation with a total daily dose of 70 units. So starting on Loop, in this case, the patient felt very comfortable starting at initial 5.0 millimole per liter. This is what she'd been targeting for pregnancy, for her fastings, and didn't really have concerns with hypoglycemia so much. So went that tighter target, and remembering with Loop, we can go down to a 4.8 if relevant. We kept essentially similar carb ratio and ISF and basals to what she'd had on the Omnipod DASH system recently. It's worth noting that we set her up with this custom preset, which we call as food high, or you might label as post-meal high. So the kind of rationale for this actually comes from some description of how the CAM-APS system is used in pregnancy. So CAM-APS being the only hybrid closed loop system approved for use in pregnancy worldwide. It's available in the UK and Europe. And the users of that system and the team in the UK who published the aAPS trial have talked about this concept of a boost. So on the CAM-APS system, you can press a button that says boost, and that strengthens the whole system. In pregnancy, what they found in the aAPS trial was that a lot of women, majority of women in the second half of pregnancy, were really needing to hit the boost button after every meal. And if you've got any familiarity with using off-label commercial systems in pregnancy, such as Tandem Control IQ or Medtronic 780G, clinicians who use those will talk about doing fake carb entries and these other sorts of strategies to sort of supplement the way that the automated insulin delivery is persisting with background insulin delivery after a meal bolus. Because when automated systems are not truly optimized for pregnancy, they can oftentimes have this tendency to lower basal or switch off basal post-meal because there's a high insulin on board from that big carb entry. And that's really unhelpful in pregnancy to have the system backing off post-meal. So in CAM-APS, they get to press the boost button. In Loop, we can kind of emulate that by setting up a custom preset at an overall insulin needs of, let's say, 120%, normal target glucose of 5.0 millimoles per liter, and say duration 2 hours. So if we see how this performs, so in our week 1 on Loop, we're now 20 weeks gestation, total daily dose 80 units, and we've brought our time in range up to 76%, starting out on Loop. But the food high custom preset really comes in. So you can see here, we've had our meal bolus, and as is often the way, we get some suspend of basal post-meal. That's maybe okay because we are on this downtrend, but we know we're going to need some solid delivery of basal insulin and probably a few clicks of auto correction along the way to get us through that 2 hours post-meal without kind of edging out above our 7.8. And so with the food high on at a 120%, that means throughout this time here, our ISF is at 120% strength, our scheduled basal is at 120% strength. So it can just support us, not so much to be doing a bunch of quick post-meal corrections, but rather to just drive the system to actually carry on with appropriate basal delivery post-meal. And we can see here that when we're still a little bit high, a couple of hours post-meal, the basal is actually going up to what would be effectively scheduled there. So it's going above our dashed blue line, which is our standard scheduled basal, and actually giving a little bit more because we're up at 120%. And then similarly with some of these types of meals, we just see by pushing on that That food high custom preset, 120%, is just able to deliver a bit more insulin in the post-bolus setting to help us out there. So the subsequent slides are just a series of weekly titrations. So those of you who work in pregnancy would know we're just pushing the carb ratio all the time. We're pushing the other settings all the time. So at the end of week 1, in response to seeing these patterns that we just looked at, put the daytime ISF a bit stronger to 1.6, put the overnight basal a bit higher. And then for this patient, she really was quite insulin resistant at this point, and we actually set up what she labeled her crazy food high custom preset, and this was an overall insulin needs of 140%. So a real boost to the basal and ISF in that post-meal setting. So with those strategies now in place, we're now 21 weeks gestation, maintaining a 77% time in range. And we're seeing something like the crazy food high come in here. It's not a substitute for strengthening the carb ratio every week, but it's sort of adjunctive to strengthening the carb ratio because it's supporting the system to keep up with basal delivery post-meal. So we can see crazy food high here, we get some more corrections and sort of keep our 2 hours, hopefully in range. And so just using those modes all the time to kind of prevent the system from switching to 0 insulin delivery post-meal. So again, weekly changes, daytime carb ratio stronger, daytime ISF stronger, keep going, marching on, total daily dose now 99 units. Similar, needing to activate these modes a lot of the time. Looks like these carb ratios need strengthening again. Keep going, carb ratio 3.2. But important to keep up the basal rates and keep them so that they're still supporting they're still kind of in proportion to the total daily dose. And again, just sort of demonstrating where we get to with continuing to strengthen week on week. So from this case, my key points would be that setting adjustment is required when insulin needs change. Loop does not auto-adapt in response to a change in total daily dose. That's not part of the loop system. And then there's a range of loop strategies that we can use to try to optimize those post-meal highs in insulin-resistant scenarios. So it could be pregnancy, it could be steroids, what have you. So of course, we're going to strengthen carb ratio. We do need to strengthen the ISF to keep ISF is Loop's, window into how insulin resistant is this patient. So we need to give Loop the right information by making sure it knows we've got we need a strong ISF. And then even above that, we can use these post-meal custom presets to sort of boost insulin delivery. The idea being that a stronger ISF at that time is going to mean that Loop will be less likely to determine that a 0 basal is required and drive appropriate continuation of basal after the meal bolus. I know there are some users who I've come across at previous presentations who said they like to use a lower target for their post-meal boost, like drop their target down to 4.5, etc. That's an option too. I find in pregnancy often the percentage delivery is really needed to help the ISF there. So to summarize Loop before we move on to our next system, Loop is a user-friendly AID system that runs on iPhone. There's a range of settings that can be titrated that are similar to what you may be used to with some commercial systems in terms of, we can change a carb ratio, change an ISF, change a basal. But there are wider customization options. So for example, the glucose target can be anywhere from 4.8 to 10 millimoles per liter. I would say my single biggest takeaway for setting titration when starting out working with Loop compared to some other systems is that your ISF is very important. So don't leave that one unexamined. It makes a big difference to the overall system. So that's finishing up with Loop there. I'll move along to Android APS. And once again, we're going to have settings to adjust, algorithm principles, and cases. Feel free to stay or go as you wish. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sounds good. Perfect. So once again, showing just relative to the AID systems that we now know about, I'm going to add, in addition to the familiar settings, which can all be adjusted in aAPS, so target, carb ratio, insulin sensitivity, basal rates. And in this one, you can change duration of insulin action. In addition to all those, we have a long list of settings that will be, likely unfamiliar to many clinicians and people with diabetes. Once again, our target has a very wide range of levels at which it can be set. These unfamiliar settings we're going to get into in a little bit more detail, but in broad strokes, these additional settings relate to two main things. One is this concept of an SMB, or super microbolus. This is the autocorrection bolus, but it's given this term SMB because of how it functions. The second thing that these more unfamiliar settings relate to is the concept of system auto-adaptation. So by that, I mean, how does yesterday's total daily dose or last week's total daily dose fold into an auto-adaptation of the system to actually perform differently? So it's the system kind of learning, in a sense, from recent total daily dose and changing settings on its own. So what is the point of these extra settings? Firstly, there is this idea of user control over the size of autoboluses. So in Loop, there is no direct control of the user to set what percentage or how high of the total autobolus required, how much is given in one Loop cycle. There's no setting for that within Loop, nor in any commercial system that I'm aware of. In aAPS, which we're talking about here, and iAPS, which has some similarities, the user has direct control over the size of their autoboluses through this setting called max SMB basal minutes, or max minutes to limit SMB to. So users can control the hard maximum size through this setting. Rather than simply setting a fixed number of units as the maximum size for an SMB, like let's say 1.5 units you could set as the maximum, it's not structured quite that way. It's structured relative to the basal rate at the time. So if I set my max SMB basal minutes to 60, then I'm indicating to the system that the maximum size of a single autocorrection, a single super microbolus, can only be 1 hour worth of scheduled basal. So if my basal rate is 1 unit per hour, and I set this at 60, I've got 1 unit is the maximum size of my SMB. The other kind of point of these extra or unfamiliar settings is auto-adaptation. So as we mentioned with Loop, there's really no kind of broad auto-adaptation within Loop. It doesn't roll in yesterday's total daily dose to change the delivery. In aAPS and in iAPS, there's actually multiple different ways in which the system can do auto-adaptation. These are auto-tune, auto-sense, and dynamic ISF, and the user may turn any of these on or off. They don't all work particularly well together, but these are all available so the user can decide in what way and to what extent would they like their system to kind of take recent total daily dose and run with it, changing settings on its own. So in terms of the algorithm combines different blood glucose predictions to determine the minimum predicted blood glucose. I'll be brief here. Please refer to the aAPS docs to see the different colored line predictions that come for each of these. But we have an insulin predicted blood glucose, carb predicted blood glucose, UAM or unannounced meal predicted blood glucose, and a zero temp predicted blood glucose. So we have a range of different possibilities for where the glucose may head under different assumptions in the coming hours. aAPS is then determining, what do we think is our minimum predicted blood glucose? Once we actually have that predicted blood glucose, again, we're doing this kind of diabetes math to just work out predicted blood glucose minus target blood glucose over our ISF. So once again, ISF has a pivotal role here. In the event that aAPS has determined, based on that algorithm and the insulin required, that we do actually require extra insulin, aAPS can do basal modulation every 5 minutes. It can also provide an SMB or a super microbolus. So this is where what would have been calculated as the temp basal is actually brought forward and given as an upfront microbolus. So you're delivering the same insulin faster. And so as a sort of graphical representation of how you can think about a super microbolus is that we're actually bringing the upcoming basal forward to an SMB now on this 5-minute loop cycle. And then most times we will then see a temporary pause in basal because we've sort of borrowed that basal, brought it forward as an SMB. In aAPS, you then just on the very next 5-minute loop cycle, that will be revisited and you may get another SMB at the next 5 minutes. So this continues to be reevaluated every 5-minute loop cycle. Because of the nature of these SMBs and how we are therefore sort of delivering a lot of our insulin needs via SMBs, it's relatively common to see a basal bolus split of about 20% basal, 80% bolus, for example. So don't necessarily consider that when you see that split that something is wrong with the distribution. And broadly on aAPS, we have the opportunity to do very similar kind of temporary percentage profiles as we talked about with Loop's custom presets. So the user can simply change their profile to 120% or 50% as may be relevant for exercise, etc. And you can set temporary targets as well. So coming on to cases. These are all type 1 diabetes cases, and they're either going to transition to aAPS or with the final case, it's an established aAPS user who commences dynamic ISF. With the first case, I'm really not going to show any of these unfamiliar type settings or modifications. It's just going to be the basics. So you can see just aAPS, just at its kind of core basics, what are we seeing? So case 1, this is a woman with type 1 with a baseline A1C of 6.8%, relatively low to sort of moderate carb diet, total daily dose 40 units. Her time in range for the month prior to starting on aAPS was about 64%. She had quite a lot of lows, nearly 5% lows, though that is using a threshold that she had set of 4.4 millimole per liter. So with our initial settings, this looks like a long list, but focusing on the top half, we have our target glucose. We bring across her carb ratio and her insulin sensitivity factor, similar to her baseline settings. Her basal rates, we bring across similar to usual. Duration of insulin action, 6 hours is would be a commonly used duration of insulin action, can be set between 5 and 9. Our max basal is typically sort of 3 to 4 times our regular basal. Max bolus size and max IOB, just in proportion to what we think is the total daily dose and usual requirements. We then have these kind of less familiar settings if you haven't used aAPS, and we're simply telling the system that we do want to enable SMBs. We want to have the ability to give those auto boluses, and we're setting the max minutes of basal to limit SMB2 to 60. A common starting point would be 30, sometimes up to 60. The system under normal configuration maxes out at 120. So at most you can give 2 hours worth of basal in a single SMB on aAPS. So we're enabling that and setting that at 60, but we're not doing anything with this dynamic ISF. Week 1 of Android APS, time in range comes up to 81%, so we're just getting corrected down to target all the time. Time low is reduced just through normal automation. So really, as with any AID system, we sort of promptly see the overnight control tightened and the overnight variability really reined in that you can see here with that spread. Just noting, it is common to see that basal bolus split. So in this case, we have bolus around 75%, basal 25%. And that's not doing anything, extreme with any of the configuration. So a couple of day-by-day views in the first week, so we can see how things are tracking here. You can see when the system's SMBs are coming in and when you kind of quite often are having some of these basal suspends when trending down. And really, in response to this initial kind of parameters, this patient strengthened her 6 a.m. carb ratio and strengthened her 6 a.m. ISF because for her, she was aiming really tight control and she found, these corrections happening through here not as kind of effective as she would have liked to, be at target at around 10 a.m. So strengthened up those two things and just did nothing with the sort of unfamiliar settings. And throughout the course of the first month, she maintained a great time in range of 75%, kept the lows down at 2%, and that's for less than 4.4, so not too many lows, and maintained an overall sort of trace that she was quite happy with. And that was just through the basic standard settings, carb ratios, ISFs, basals, and running quite happily on aAPS that first month. I'm going to come now to a case in which a preconception case in which the settings starting out on aAPS, this is for a woman who is preconception, and so we're going to use a 3.5 to 7.8 millimole per liter. She was, I seem to have lost my slide that has her pre-aAPS information, but her time in range was about 60% for 3.5 to 7.8. So she was on her way to optimizing pre-pregnancy and wanted to use aAPS to assist her with that. And so starting out, her configuration was much the same as her previous Omnipod Dash settings. Again, just went 60 minutes for the max minutes of basal limit SMB2 and did nothing with dynamic ISF. So this is her first week on aAPS in a closed loop mode with SMBs. And I'm just going to show on that first couple of days, day 1 to day 2, we're getting lows all over the place. These corrections, auto corrections from the system, these SMBs are coming in and driving lows. So we're getting, over 6% time below range. So we really need to weaken this ISF. Did that straight away so that in the second, the back end of the first week, day 5 to 7, we've got that ISF at 4.2, and we've kind of resolved that situation with the frequent lows. These auto corrections from the system are not pulling her down into frank lows now. So that's stabilized in terms of lows, but we haven't really improved our time in range. We're just at about 61% there. So you can see, looking at this day-by-day trace, that, prandial highs are the issue. There's a range of strategies you would use for this. You could absolutely strengthen carb ratio. I note that this carb ratio is already strong relative to the other settings, and we're getting long suspends with no basal after this meal. And so strengthening the carb ratio you absolutely could do, but you're actually just going to create a balance where there's an even higher IOB that aAPS is considering, and then you are getting even more basal suspends because aAPS is thinking there's a lot of insulin on board for this person. So at this point, in addition to doing kind of carb ratio strengthening, tweaking ISF, optimizing everything with all your normal mealtime considerations, pre-bolusing, etc., we have this option for a post-meal boost, like we talked about with Loop. And so what we did here is, kept the ISF at 4.2 overnight, but went to 4.0 during the day just to try to get a middle ground. And then added this 120% temp profile as a post-meal boost to see, can we encourage the system to run more appropriate insulin in the background after we've had a meal bolus. And so this is what we see here with week 2, with that strategy, getting our time in range up to 80%. And so with the way it displays on Nightscout for aAPS, when the patient is changing over their percentage profile, we actually see it in these light blue kind of vertical text there. So you can see she's switched on a 120% here and trying to encourage the system to give more boluses during that time when she switches on that 120%. So in that way, we're able to kind of encourage the system, don't go to zero insulin delivery after a bolus, because our ISF is actually now 120% strength. Let's actually push some background insulin delivery. So in addition to that, what can we consider doing for this patient that may be relevant, since we're using a system in which the user has control over the size of their auto boluses? So let's think back to what we were talking about with the unfamiliar settings with aAPS. There's this idea that we have direct control of the size of the auto boluses through max minutes of basal to limit SMB2. So what does that look like? So our patient is now on week 2, and she has those same settings we just talked about. But despite doing all of that great stuff, the 120% post-meal boost, having settings configured as they are, I'm still occasionally seeing a meal that looks like this. So this is a restaurant meal, and so carb count uncertain, timing uncertain, does a 60-gram entry, fine. But what we see from the system is that as soon as it clocks that we're having this dramatic upstroke in our glycemia, it starts coming in with the biggest SMBs that it's allowed to give, which is 0.6 units. The cap is 0.6 because we've set the basal at 0.6 units per hour, and we've set the max SMB basal minutes at 60. So we're telling the system your cap is 0.6. So in terms of what the system can then do, it's giving 0.6, 0.6, 0.6, 0.6, 0.6 about 6 times successively. And that doesn't seem to be cutting it. The patient's getting frustrated as she sees this ongoing rise, and the patient actually comes in with a 2-unit manual bolus then at the end of this series at 2 p.m. So with the nature of aAPS, I really felt we should be able to get the system to perform better than this in response to marked prandial rise. So we want to configure the system to be able to push stronger on those SMBs, because like we all know, even setting aside pumps, even just with MDI, you want the first correction to be the most effective. You don't, to really optimize. So we put basal to 0.7 during the day, which looked like it was probably needed anyway, and then put our max SMB basal minutes to 90. So we now have 1.5 hours worth of basal that's allowed to be given as a single SMB, which would be a 1.05 unit correction. If we then are also applying a 120% to our basal, that could be even higher. And so showing another kind of similar meal situation where we've bolus, but having pretty dramatic takeoff. We now, because we've changed the SMB setup, we're actually allowing the system to do its first SMB. In this case, is actually 1.1 units. So it's giving a more solid SMB up front. And then we're seeing kind of decrementing SMB sizes, 1.1, 0.8, 0.3 across these initial 3 5-minute leads, because the system on each 5-minute loop cycle is taking into account its insulin on board. It already knows it has the 1.1 from the first SMB, so the second one oftentimes doesn't need to be as large. So instead of taking 6 or 7 loop cycles to deliver the correction that was needed, it's packing a punch and really giving it up front, predominantly in the first 1 to 2 loop cycles, aAPS cycles. And so we're correcting a little quicker, a little more effectively. And these are all kind of gearing towards helping people actually do unannounced meals, but it can be really helpful in this setting as well. And so while you're always going to be trying to optimize your carb ratio, your bolus time, this is an adjunctive strategy to help with rapid prandial rise. And if we can give more effective, more upfront, then we don't need to keep correcting those 0.6s as many times. And it may actually make our risk of late post-meal lows lesser as well, because we're not still doing corrections an hour after the meal. The aAPS docs recommend not to set the value higher than 90 minutes. And as this would kind of lead to a point where the algorithm might not be able to accommodate in terms of doing a basal suspend later. And as mentioned, the kind of max within normal system parameters in aAPS is 120 for the max basal minutes. Final unfamiliar concept in aAPS that we'll cover is this auto adaptation piece. So what could we do if we wanted the system to auto adapt? So there's been a range of different options kind of put together over the years, whereby a user could switch on one or more than one of these options. Think of AutoTune as a statistical regression. So this is comparing the profile settings with what actually happened. So it's then going to allow the user to make small iterative adjustments to their settings. So for a clinician, think of this a little bit like if you sit down with somebody who's on a commercial AID system and you take a look at what their normal schedule basal is, and then you take a look at what the basal is that they're receiving on their automation. Sometimes you look at those two together and think, do I actually need to tweak their regular schedule basal a little bit so that it's actually reflecting their true requirements as demonstrated to me by automation? Think of autotune a little bit like that. So it's, can we actually take aAPS's, what it's informing us about what's actually being given, and kind of use that to tweak over time. So for example, with basals, this is going to be small iterative adjustments. So this might be something where the user would run some auto-tune and tweak their settings over a number of weeks. Coming then to AutoSense, this is something which is on a more dynamic basis, in the sense that it's a more live day-to-day kind of parameter. And AutoSense is calculating the percentage that reflects how sensitivity over 8 or 24 hours is differing from the profile ISF. So again, kind of what is aAPS observing about how corrections play out on the blood glucose, and what can aAPS infer from that as relates to, oh, we're actually quite sensitive at the moment. Our ISF actually doesn't need to be as strong as what it is. So we'll see that with actually displaying on the user's home screen. So if somebody's quite insulin sensitive, so when aAPS is giving them their corrections, their glucose is dropping quite a lot. AutoSense is saying, oh, we're sensitive at the moment. You actually don't need that much insulin. You're only at like 83%, as a kind of percentage, where 100% would be you need the full amount that you're normally programmed for. And so we're running at 83%, and AutoSense can make small adjustments to ISF basal and or target, depending how you configure, and it can do that reflecting sensitivity over 8 or 24 hours. It will only do relatively small adjustments here, but the user can see it right there on their home screen where they're sitting with their AutoSense with this up-down arrow. Finally, the kind of third option that's there is dynamic ISF. So users talk about how, or the developers and community talk about how many people found AutoSense, well, it was okay. It wasn't as aggressive, or it didn't pack as much punch as they perhaps would have liked. And so dynamic ISF was kind of developed in that vein, and we saw it added as part of aAPS 3.2 release in 2023. So dynamic ISF is an even more minute-to-minute variation in ISF as a function of recent total daily dose and current blood glucose. Thinking of this as this concept that people talk about, where when they're really high with their glucose, their normal ISF doesn't cut it. They actually need an even bigger correction. This idea of kind of altered tissue sensitivity to insulin when profoundly hyperglycemic. Something that a lot of people with diabetes sort of do somewhat intuitively. So dynamic ISF, this is laid out here really just so you know that the math of this is all fully understandable. There is no black box. It's known exactly how it works, all freely available here from the aAPS docs. So it adapts the ISF dynamically based on total daily dose and glucose values. It uses Chris Wilson's model to determine ISF instead of kind of a static profile setting. We're used to a static ISF. It doesn't change with anything. It just is the ISF. So the idea of the dynamic ISF is it's using your traditional 100 rule if you're a millimole per liter user, or an 1800 rule if you're a mg per dl user, for your ISF as relates to total daily dose. And it's just applying a natural logarithm to that so that the current glucose at the time of the correction is part of the determination of the ISF. It's weighted against 7-day average total daily dose, previous day's total daily dose, and recent 8 hours insulin. And there's also an adjustment factor, which allows the user to specify a value between 1 and 300%, which acts as a multiplier. So just as a visual, calculating out, I observed directly one of my patients who was using dynamic ISF, and selected out what's their ISF doing at various glucose levels on a particular day, and plotted out here. So you can see that there's this logarithmic curve, and that as their glucose level moves higher, they're actually getting a stronger ISF down at 0.5-ish as their glucose is higher, compared to when their glucose is lower, they're getting a weaker ISF. So the ISF that aAPS is applying each and every 5-minute cycle is a dynamic ISF, which is moving along this curve. So, a case to kind of draw this out and show as an example, this is a pregnant patient, so requirements changing all the time. She was already on aAPS at this stage, really struggling with nausea, rising insulin resistance. We're 16 weeks at this time, struggling to pre-bolus, time in range 60% at a 3.5 to 7.8 target. She decided to give dynamic ISF a try in the context of kind of inadequate control and then a recent upgrade to the aAPS 3.2 here in 2023. And all of her configuration is laid out here. This was changing every week, strengthening carb ratios, etc. But the key thing is at this point, dynamic ISF was switched on with an adjustment factor of 50%, meaning that just her straight 100 rule or 1800 rule for TDD, if you just apply that and then the natural logarithm for the glucose at the time, we're actually telling aAPS actually just go half strength on that ISF. And that was kind of a conservative starting point because at this point, the ISF that we were using was not as strong as what a 100 rule would have called for. So her total daily dose is 52 units, and with dynamic ISF on, her ISF was typically ranging between 1.8 and 2.5 at this point. Highs with the eye of faith are being brought down more promptly than previously because when she's up at 8, 9, 10 with her glucose level, the ISF is pushing stronger to about a 1.8, which I wouldn't have been comfortable having her at 1.8 all the time because of lows, but it's using stronger ISF at the time when she's high to be more aggressive about correcting highs. So we carry on. That's all looking safe at 50%. So we push the adjustment factor to 60%. We're starting to try to push up to that 70% time in range here. And our ISF is now kind of ranging 1.1 to 1.9 through the day, depending where glucose is at. Now, at this point, our TDD is 101 units per day. We're gestationally 28 weeks. And as we keep pushing along, we've actually pushed our dynamic ISF adjustment factor to 70%. At this point, our ISF is able to sit anywhere between about 0.8 and 1.6 typically, so that it's able to push stronger when we need it to that 0.8 when we're high. Of course, throughout this whole time, other titrations to regular settings were made. So just to lay out an example of dynamic ISF during a one-day period when this woman was 32 weeks gestation, at this point her total daily dose was 130 units. This is the graph I showed before, but just laying out exactly which glucose level. So when we're 5.2 glucose, our ISF is 1. When we're up at 10, our ISF is 0.5. So then every 5-minutely cycle is using an ISF of 0.5. So it's really kind of driving the corrections. And if you want to see the math, that's the math of how a glucose of 7.7 or 138 mg per DL translates through into an ISF of 0.6 using the natural logarithm. Just really important to note that if we're taking on board any of these auto-adaptation considerations and we're asking aAPS, hey, take into account yesterday's total daily dose and therefore strengthen me if yesterday was a high total daily dose day. So this can have unintended consequences for sure. So total daily insulin at this particular point in time in December was 56 units, pretty typical day. You can see we're not bolusing on time, continuing to have issues with nausea, etc. Then we have a really high total daily dose day on the Thursday, up at 95 units. This could be for any number of reasons. Could have been a pod failure, could have been whatever. But aAPS is actually taking that 95 units and plugging that into the dynamic ISF as we've asked it to do. And so now the next day, Friday, we have a really strong ISF that has fully integrated a 95 unit total daily dose into its considerations. And so we're getting wild corrections driven by this dynamic ISF. So close attention is needed to ensure the appropriateness of dynamic ISF if the patient is going to have major swings in daily dose. To summarize aAPS, this is the open source AID system which is available to Android users. There are definitely some features which add unfamiliarity and complexity, such as the super micro bolus concept and the auto adaptation options such as dynamic ISF. though I would say the system can be kept relatively straightforward if desired. Acknowledgements: the open source diabetes community and developers are the absolute, brains and gurus of this whole space. As clinicians, we can, provide kind of support to individual patients who would seek it from us while they're using these systems, but really the core of the algorithm principles, the development, the strategies all lie with the open source community. I really thank the BCDiabetes patients who kindly agreed to use of their data for education purposes in these slides. I thank our BCDiabetes team, Medical Director Dr. Tom Elliott, and our diabetes technologists, Nabil Khan and Prince Sevilla. And here's my contact details at BCDiabetes.